Thank you very much. Can we start, Fernanda, or we wait?
Uh, just a second.
Okay.
Just 2 more seconds.
Okay.
Now, yes, you can start.
Okay, Philip, you can go on. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Adriano, for that introduction. I think this is the first time I've ever been streamed live on YouTube. I don't know whether to be excited about that or not. Anyway, I want to thank you very much, Fernanda, for inviting me to this. Obviously, I would have preferred an in-person invitation to Brazil. That would be very exciting one day. I do hope we're going to catch up on that. But for today, I have to be in the UK anyway for strong personal reasons. So it's very good that we can do this, even if it's not in person. What I want to talk about today is mainly this book, which I hope some of you recognize already because the topic is obviously financialization. It came out, well, in the middle of the pandemic or relatively early in the pandemic. I edited it together with Natasha van der Zwaan and Daniel Mertens, two people whom I met while doing my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. And we always stayed in touch and always kind of kept on talking about financialization and how this concept was useful to us, but also sometimes our frustrations about it. And then ultimately on Natasha's prompting, we decided to do a book together about it. And so that's mainly what I'm going to be focusing on today, even though I'm also going to be giving a little bit of a sort of glimpse case study of how I think the concept of financialization can be applied still very productively through the window of my own research. Fernanda, Adriano, can you please nod if you see my screen shared at the moment? Can you see the, yes, okay, great. So you can see my title slide here. Yeah, so that's just a closer image of the handbook cover again. Maybe just to briefly point out that we even did a blog about this very interesting cover image that we chose, because we were, as you're doing when you're doing a handbook like this, at some point the publisher asks you, so what do you want to be on the cover? And then you say, well, you're a professional publisher. Can you send us some ideas? And then they sent us, I think, 5 pictures of different glass buildings that vaguely reminded them of banks, it would seem. And we thought that was such a boring way to represent what financialization is about. And Natasha, who lives in the Netherlands, had recently been to a history museum in Amsterdam, where she came across this print, which from the mid 19th century, so early mid 1800s, which was about a tax. It was a cartoon about a tax that was introduced at the time, and it was more all about the government sort of finding new ways to squeeze money and value out of, as you can see here, society represented through this village, and you can see a bit of nature there with the trees. And we thought that this was a very apt image for capturing what financialization does, which is finding new ways of squeezing value out of everyday things. And especially also the image to us represented that there's also work going on behind financialization. It's not a natural, inevitable process, but rather it actually takes the active agency of politicians, of economic actors, of workers in the financial system, of, let's say, cultural influences as well, to make finance squeeze more value out of society and nature and everyday life. So with that way of introducing the book through its cover, they say in English you should never judge a book by its cover, but I think you should judge our book by its cover, because the cover is pretty cool, and so is the book. And so this is my little presentation about financialization, economy, and society as a way of taking stock of the rapidly evolving research landscape through this book, which, as I said, we published just under 2 years ago, or just about 2 years ago. Right, how can I get the next slide? What is going on? Here we go. Yeah, financialization studies has, of course, become a really, or financialization has become a really popular term, I guess, at least by social scientific standards. Recently, I was talking to somebody who works at the Bretton Woods Project here in London, and who is trying to carry the term financialization much more into the civil society mainstream. So he was saying that, well, yes, it's clearly become a very popular term in the social sciences as a way of making sense of a lot of things that are going on, but outside of the social sciences, it's still really not taken hold. At least what you can see on this graph here is just how many journal articles with the word financialization in their title were published per year over the last 20 years or so, with practically nothing going on before Gerald Epstein put out his book, Financialization and the World Economy. There was then the Reader put together by Ismail Erturk and a number of his collaborators at the University of Manchester, called Financialization at Work. You can see the term peaking a little bit around the great financial crisis, then subsiding a little bit, and really growing in popularity. And perhaps I should ask Natasha if she's in any way interested in updating the graph and to see if it's risen even faster since we published our handbook than it did after she published her seminal article, Making Sense of Financialization, in 2014. So clearly, this is a rapidly growing field of research and literature, and we felt that it was time to take stock of it. One way of taking stock of it, this is all, basically I'm summarizing a little bit what our introductory chapter says, which I'm going to be sharing a link to at the end. I can also pop it into the chat at some point. Now, in our introductory chapter, we look at, which disciplines are studying financialization. And we went through this collection of articles that we found and just kind of assigned, went by the journals that had published them and looked at what kind of journals, what kind of disciplinary backgrounds use this term. And perhaps unsurprisingly, most widely used, or the single largest area in which financialization was used or is used, is in interdisciplinary social science journals. So yes, even though it's about the economy in the sense that that financialization is an economic phenomenon, and that's clearly here as the second most popular field, it's in a way a naturally interdisciplinary term because it also connects with cultural studies, sociology, political economy, political science, geography, where the term has really received a lot of reception as well. And just interesting to note, I mean, we added here heterodox economics because we did find it important to point out that although perhaps it's gradually making its way in there a little bit more, orthodox economics has really ignored financialization, both as a conceptual handle, but also as an issue even in the first place, quite a lot. And mainly it's been picked up in heterodox economics, that is Keynesian, post-Keynesian, Sraffian, Marxian, and so on, or just generally not that mainstream economics. And also perhaps, though we don't have a graph for this, quite noticeably, financialization has been picked up in economic research much more strongly outside of the US and the UK and Western Europe. And I think there's something really interesting in the fact that I think it's much more permeated already into the the study of economics in countries of the global south or the global periphery or whatever terms it's acceptable or good to use these days, to make sense of what's going on in the way the economy is changing, much more than business and finance studies in the global north have. So another thing we did in making sense of financialization, in mapping this space out, was to see it, well, how is it defined? And perhaps Gerald Epstein's definition is really often quoted. You might all know, or many of you will know it, the way Gerald Epstein has termed financialization as being, quote, the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. But we thought, well, it's not good enough to just reproduce that. And we've noticed that, quite a lot of different ways have been proposed over time of conceptualizing or explaining what financialization is about. I'm personally a little bit more partial to Greta Krippner's definition of financialization as a pattern of accumulation in which profits primarily accrue through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. And as you can see over on the right, these are the two most regularly cited definitions of financialization, and they're both at the macro level. Now, that's not everything. And so you can see, looking a little bit further down, Randy Martin's definition of financialization as at much more a micro level, looking at the level of households and individual people and the way they think about finance, and him saying, well, financialization is about, to quote, an orientation towards accounting and risk management into all domains of life. So we found it important to map out these different definitions and to look, well, what do they cover and what do they not cover? And I'm not going to run through all of them. That would bore you. But what we found was that, in a way, looking across these very different definitions and the different ways the term financialization is used and applied, it was a little bit like the parable of the blind men, or the blind wise men. Sometimes it's said, interestingly, they're always men, but this parable of blind people and the elephant, which basically, goes to say, well, these blind wise people were feeling different parts of the elephant, and the man feeling the trunk says, oh, it's like a snake, an elephant must be a snake. And another man feeling the side and says, it's a very wide thing, an elephant is like a wall, and so on. And they're all feeling different parts of the animal and coming to very different conclusions about its nature. And we didn't think that there was any necessity to kind of add another definition into this very wide space and perhaps add to the confusion more, because what we found with the term financialization, because of these very different definitions, is that on the one hand, there have been really divergent claims about the nature of financialization, and that these have fragmented the field, that there is an increasing tendency of, say, people who adopt a much more economics-oriented view and definition of financialization to no longer engage so strongly with much more anthropological literature, or vice versa, that there's a kind of political science, political economy study that isn't talking very strongly to other disciplines anymore. At the same time, we did want to recognize that the fact that there are so many different approaches to financialization, there have been so many different definitions and ways of thinking about it, this diversity has also facilitated the term's wide reception and uptake. It's precisely because it's such a heterodox concept, because it's so open in how it's used and how it's accessible to many different scholars. That has meant that it's been so widely taken up. I'm just going to briefly go back to this. Taken up across so many disciplines. I mean, it might well be true that if there was just one dominant definition, it would perhaps only fit for political science or fit only for economics, and not then be so inviting for people publishing in journals that match other disciplines to be engaging with this. And of course, again, we can see the real heterodoxy and the heterogeneity of these definitions reflected in the fact that so much of the research is just interdisciplinary. Milford, your microphone is on, so I can hear rustling. Nice to see you here. Yeah, the purpose of our handbook was to try to reflect the breadth and depth of financialization studies. And if you're not looking at me sharing my screen, but just looking for a second at my camera, I mean, you can see how big the result is when you try to reflect the breadth and depth of financialization studies. It's a 44 chapter book, and it's running to nearly 500 pages, but that's just what happens then when you're engaging with such a broad field. And in putting together this book and writing the introduction, we decided to coin the term financialization studies, because we thought in a way this by now this is its own field of study. It's not a part of finance. It's not a part of economics. It's not part of political economy. It's not part of geography. It's a place where all of these and many more disciplines and areas of interest have come together. And that's why we think this is financialization studies. So, the value of financialization we find as a term, and I'm going to come to some critical observations on it in a little bit as well, but we find that the term has a lot of value despite some of the criticisms raised against it, because it's a word that gives a name to, well, a lot of things that are going on that social scientists recognize in their work, that critical economists have drawn attention to, but also that people feel in their everyday lives, this kind of growing importance of finance in very many different ways. And so looking across that heterogeneous field of financialization studies, we sort of realized that there are three things that unite this field despite its heterogeneity. And the first is this focus on the autonomy of finance, on studying finance as something that is quite autonomous, that has become autonomous. So it's about an understanding of finance as not or no longer subservient to the productive economy, but rather finance being an autonomous realm that increasingly influences and even dominates other realms of society, other parts of the economy. And so firstly, what unites financialization scholars is that they recognize and seek to understand and explain this emancipation of finance, or emancipation of finance vis-a-vis other things, this empowerment of finance. The second thing is that we think people who work with the term financialization, the people who work in this field of financialization studies, are anti-Panglossian about finance. And I'm just going to explain that briefly. I owe it to, I think it was my lecturer, Ha-Jun Chang, when I was doing my master's, who introduced us to this figure from literary history called Dr. Pangloss. Oh God, I should have looked it up before. I think it was in Voltaire that Pangloss comes up. And Pangloss is this scientist, this scholar who travels the world, and sort of every time something bad happens, he says, well, don't worry, this is the best state the world could be in. Don't try to do anything about it. It's not a problem. If it is that way, then it's because God wanted it to be that way. And we thought that the field of financialization studies is anti-Panglossian in that it takes the opposite view. It critiques, it does not accept these empirical developments. It does not accept this autonomization of finance, this emancipation of finance vis-a-vis other elements of the economy, of society. And it links its criticism of this emancipation of finance to other socioeconomic and political developments, such as rising inequality, growing macroeconomic instability, social precarity, and the loss of democratic accountability. So financialization studies, even though, of course, the ways in which it's critical and the depth to which scholars are critical, but fundamentally found, secondly, financialization studies is a critical area of studies in that it does not accept, and it rather seeks to challenge and ideally change this dominance of finance. And the third thing, finally, that we find unites financialization studies is that it goes beyond the economic. So financialization scholars study finance not only, or not just primarily as an economic issue, unlike those who work in mainstream finance or finance research traditions. So of course, there are many economists and heterodox economists mainly who work on financialization as an economic issue, but pretty much everyone who works with this topic, works on this topic and works with the concept, at least in smart ways, connects it to wider political, social, cultural, etc. issues. It's not just the economy on its own. So financialization studies is all about connecting changes in finance with other shifts in politics, economics, and social relations and culture. And financialization studies scholars have done a lot to articulate these both as causes and consequences. So to not say, well, it's the economy that causes societal change necessarily, or it's societal change that has led to this change in the economy, but really understanding directionality in both ways. So that's what we found unites financialization studies, despite its really wide range and heterogeneity. This focus on finance as an increasingly autonomous, dominant realm. Secondly, critiquing that and wanting to change it and wanting to understand how the world could be different, not taking it for granted. And thirdly, always connecting this change in finance with wider socioeconomic and political issues. What did we do then in the handbook, or what the handbook is composed of? As I said, it's 44 chapters. I'm not going to run you through each of them. That would again be really boring. But just to briefly outline the architecture of this book, in the first part, we wanted to take stock. It consists of 6 parts, and in the first part, we invited a number of really good scholars, and we were very lucky we felt with the people who were willing to participate in this and came back and collaborated with us on taking stock of the financialization literature, looking at that really broad question of what is financialization, and also trying to engage with critical debates about how useful the concept is and what its limitations are. So Brett Christophers, some of you might know, published an article in 2015 called The Limits to Financialization, which was above all else about the limits of financialization as a concept. So we were really pleased that actually we got him, Brett Christophers, and Ben Fine to open up the book with a chapter in which they debate each other about how this concept is useful and what its limits are, and so on. So it was written as an exchange of letters, and it's a really interesting sort of debate to read if you're already involved in this debate in yourself, in some form yourself. Ismail Ertuğ wrote a chapter for us about how useful the concept is in studying corporate behavior and the sort of classical accounting approaches. Sheila Dow, Paul Langley, they all were really pleased that these great scholars contributed to that first part in which we take stock of the financialization literature. The second part, we decided to focus more on methodological issues. So in the end, looking at different disciplinary or epistemological ways of approaching financialization. So what kind of research designs are used to study financialization? And in what ways particular methods might be better equipped at studying certain aspects of financialization than others. So we tried to have a sort of run through the main disciplines, the main epistemologies that have been applied in this field, with authors like Yves Chiapello providing a chapter on the socio-technical, on financialization as a socio-technical studies field. Hadas Weiss basically providing insights into how the concept is used in anthropology. Dimitris Sotiropoulos and Ariana Hillig writing from the perspective of heterodox economics, and so on. Because we were also quite aware that this, as a handbook, would probably quite often be picked up by not just people who are already established scholars in the field, but also younger researchers, perhaps people doing their masters or starting their PhDs, using this term financialization and wanting to understand how in their disciplinary canon or in relation to the field they're working in, this, getting a bit of more of a nuts and bolts and getting a bit of a sense of just how to practically wield this tool. So that's what that second part covers. Third chapter is the third part is first of kind of 3 linked parts that are all about different levels and layers at which financialization operates. So this one, very macro level, we were looking at structures, spaces, and sites. Different chapters looking at how global finance is spatially distributed, at the question of whether there even is such a thing as a global financial system or whether it's rather geographically variegated, and how the local and everyday manifestations of financialization that are felt in individual people's lives and so on are linked with this wider level. I'm not going to go through the people who contributed here, except to briefly say, of course, you'll recognize some of the big names of particular fields of financialization studies, like Manuel Albers on housing markets and that sort of geographic spatialization question. Yingyao Wang looking at the financialization of the state and the role of the state in financialization. Eva Karbowski wrote a really interesting chapter on, I'm drawing a blank here, on essentially the financialization of individual cities and kind of financial marketplaces and particularly in the global south. Sarah Bracking on financialization of the environment, and so on. As I said, that was the first of 3 sort of linked parts. The second part looking at actors, agency, and politics. So what are the actors? Who are the actors that shape financialization, and how do they shape it? What were the policy choices that have led to financialization? And to what extent do public, corporate, and private actors have competing or aligning interests in this rise of finance? People like Benjamin Brown and Daniela Gabor, they wrote a chapter about stock exchanges, about the role of central banks in financialization. Johannes Petri, who, it was interesting, had actually worked at the stock exchange and was doing a PhD at the time on the stock exchanges not as platforms, but as actually actors in driving financialization. Brooke Harrington on offshore finance and trusts, Felipe Gonzalez on microcredit and household debt in the global south. Of course, Lena Lavinas, whom you probably all know about the financialization of the welfare state. And we ended up with something that we called the Labor Forum, where we have 4 shorter chapters, which I think can all be read quite handily, next to each other or right one after the other, because we realized that in all this, there was a kind of empty space where the question was, well, what role does labor, what role does the working class and labor politics actually play in financialization, in resisting it or enabling it, or in some way or other engaging with it? And because we couldn't find anybody to really write the chapter about that, we invited 4 different reflections on how to locate financialization in relation to labor politics and the working class. And that's where this Labor Forum came from. Techniques, finally, the third of those sort of 3 linked sections: techniques, technologies, and cultures. We had a number of chapters looking at who or what actually controls financial practices, if anyone controls it at all, or anything controls it at all. What does it mean and feel like to be financialized? Do we now live in a culture of finance? People like Max Haven writing about the financialization of culture, even the financialization of art. Rob Aitken, Jean Lazarus, who wrote a really good chapter about the way in which financial thinking is inculcated, is sort of taught to people through financial literacy and education programs that have really mushroomed around the world. John Montgomery looking at the kind of cultural diffusion of financialization into people's everyday lives and household thinking. And lastly, we didn't want to end it with this, as financialization as being this kind of inevitable, juggernaut or monolith that can't be stopped and something that just keeps on spreading and spreading, and rather wanted to look at also, in a final section, the instabilities, the insecurities, and the discontents or the resistance to, the pushback against financialization. So that final section, 6 or 7 chapters, looks at the question of, well, is financialization inevitable? How can it be reversed? And if so, then how could counter movements or strategies and policies that seek to oppose financialization look like? So Olivier Godeschaux, for example, with a chapter on the inequality dynamics of financialization and how it sort of creates a self-reinforcing destabilization. Gerald Epstein, one of the earliest scholars to study financialization, looking at how banks could be re-regulated to undo financialization. A really interesting chapter by an Austrian central banker, Beat Weber, on the limitations and pitfalls, mainly of alternative currencies as a sort of way of halting financialization. And the last chapter in the book was by several authors linked to the Committee to Abolish Third World Debt, CADTM. That's, of course, basically looking at how different countries around the world have also found ways to, stop meeting the demands of finance anymore and defaulting strategically on credit, and thereby putting a spanner in the works of financialization. So sorry, that was a slightly longer overview of this book, but as I said, it's a very large book, and well, either you can access it through your university library, or you may be able to afford the paperback version, which has been out now for a little more than a year, or otherwise, I'm sure there are ways and means in which you can find it in the dark corners of the web. And I'm not able to name any particular places because otherwise I would probably be breaching some sort of copyright stipulations with my publisher. But I'm sure, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure that it's accessible to you somewhere out there. And as I said, at the end, I'm at least going to be sharing a link to where you can find the introduction chapter. Now, in putting all this together, we thought a little bit about the problems that the financialization term and concept and theory and research has, and the solutions that may be found to them. And I'm going to say there are basically two main problems that this field has. The first are just issues that come with becoming an adult concept, with being a maturing field of research, which is just that the concept has widened and grown so much that it's perhaps almost feeling a bit overused. I like to use this idea of conceptual stretch marks. So it's grown to the point where, well, it's visibly stretching, and just seeing financialization everywhere and will lead to a sort of sense that this is a bit tautological. There's a tangible sense of financialization fatigue that even we felt when we were putting together this book, because we didn't want another set of chapters or another chapter on the financialization of this thing, this particular commodity, or financialization in that particular country. It's a little bit dissatisfactory to always find these, to find the concept stretching and expanding to the point where it's just becoming so descriptive and not particularly meaningful or interesting anymore in those ways. And this, of course, links to, secondly, what Brett Christopher's, I've already mentioned it, has called the limits of financialization, which he says are both analytic limits, theoretic limits, strategic limits, optic limits, and empiric limits. And I don't think I can explain all of those. But we then tried to think, well, okay, we recognize these critiques of the field and see that it is a problem when the term is mushrooming to the point where, a lot of research is coming out that perhaps isn't that radical or sharp anymore, and thought about what could be parts of the solution in terms of perhaps not rescuing the concept. It doesn't have to be rescued yet, but let's say in terms of maintaining the conceptual value and worth of financialization. And we found that we suggest in our introductory chapter that scholars should use conceptualizations of finance, which are limiting, mechanism-oriented, and contextual. So this goes back to the fact that we didn't want to offer our own new definition, like a meta definition of what financialization is about. And we recognize that everybody, in a way, needs their own definition in order to use this concept appropriately to their subject of study, to their object of study. But when they do so, they should firstly define what they mean. They should limit it and clarify the boundaries of what is and isn't financialization, not just calling everything financialization. Secondly, conceptualizations of financialization should be mechanism-oriented, we find. That means it shouldn't just be descriptive, but should be about clarifying causes and consequences. What is leading to what? Is it financialization that is causing something else, or is financialization being caused by something? So make it clear and conceptual what's going on here. And thirdly, definitions should be contextual. They should define what they're valid for and what they're not valid for, and ideally also, be comparative with other fields, rather than just saying, hooray, I found financialization in this country too, or in that commodity too, and that's enough. Well, we say, no, it isn't. It's really important to also work in a contextual and comparative way. And lastly, in doing so, to always answer the so what question. Why does this actually matter that we can see financialization happening here? Whom does this affect? What is this affect? So I'm going to wrap up with, I have another maybe 5 minutes, I hope, at least. So I've clarified with the hosts of this at the beginning, and I'd like to use them to just briefly give a kind of case study or an example from my own research of how I think the financialization concept matters. My PhD was, in my PhD, I kind of coined this term, the financialization of poverty, which I used to try and make sense of what microfinance was doing effectively. And of course, I don't have to say much more about that because I can see Milford, who not only is, probably the greatest scholar on microfinance, at least the greatest critical scholar on it, wrote the book on why doesn't microfinance work. And also I was very grateful to have his advice and his input on my PhD. But anyway, to me, the concept of financialization, this term helped me make a lot more sense of what I was looking at. And without financialization, I don't think I would have been able to come to anything like the same answers that for me were satisfying on what is wrong with microfinance. So in my PhD work, I ended up defining, and as I said, I think it's always important to define financialization and to kind of define it in ways that are conceptual and mechanism orientated and meaningful. So I defined it as being, quote, the recent and ongoing expansion of the frontier of financial accumulation based on changes in politics, economics, social relations, and culture. And so what's going on in this definition is, of course, when I say the recent and ongoing expansion of the frontier of financial accumulation, that means to say it's not about looking at what, well, Rudolf Hilferding was looking at in the late 19th century with, financial capitalism in that era, but more looking at the modern era of financial expansion. And secondly, it's about the expansion of the frontier of financial accumulation. So that's the mechanism here, based on changes in politics, economics, social relations, and culture. Linking this to the end of cash as a kind of case study of how the financialization concept, I think, can still be really productively applied to ongoing or emergent issues. We can see globally, and definitely accelerated with the pandemic, a digitalization of payments that actually enables new financial accumulation patterns. And it does so by generating new revenue streams from transactions that people need for their everyday lives. As represented here in the bottom right by this picture of cash moving into a mobile wallet. But also above that, we can see some of the very deliberate lobbying efforts and political influencing that has been undertaken by really powerful actors in the payments industry. Hello, somebody's talking. Yeah, thank you. In the payments industry, to remove cash from the picture, there is an international organization called the Better Than Cash Alliance, which is funded by all the large payments companies and the MasterCard Foundation, but also at the same time is strongly endorsed by the United Nations framework. And that raises questions of what happens when cash is removed from the picture and money is digitized, and why this is happening. And actors like the Better Than Cash Alliance have been really fueling these cultural narratives of inclusion and progress as a driving force behind the digitalization of payments. And the point I want to make over the next few slides is that these cultural narratives and these cultural narratives are the main terrain on which the struggles over the future of financialization, over the expansion of the frontier of financial accumulation, will be contested and waged. So, I'm sorry, there's a typo there. We can trace this back to the origins of the global financial inclusion mission or agenda from the world of microfinance, which was all about giving small loans to poor people in low-income countries and charging them back with high rates of interest. And what I found in my early research and my PhD research was that, in a sense, microfinance works. It might fail as an anti-poverty policy. It clearly has failed as an anti-poverty policy, but it has worked in the sense of successfully financializing poverty. It's turned poverty into something that is relevant, systemically relevant for finance. It is now possible for those who control flows of capital to engage with the poor, with global poverty, and to do so in a way that leads to financial accumulation, that increases profits. And this is what I mean by financializing poverty, as what microfinance works at. And since then, microfinance as a term has really fallen out of favor, and it's been brought under this much wider umbrella of financial inclusion. which I think means a few things. It firstly, of course, ties in this notion of microfinance with much more positive sounding notions of inclusion. It's no longer about just delivering financial services. It's like that if you are not using financial services, you're not included. So you must be financially included. And it's also brought in a much wider range of actors. So mainstream finance players and fringe finance players like payday loan companies are all now moving into the poverty lending space that used to be just dominated by microfinance institutions as new players who are financially accumulating through financializing poverty. I'm going to just say about the last bullet point, the new rationale. With financial inclusion, there's also been this added sense in which finance, perhaps it's no longer even necessarily about increasing people's incomes, like what was always the idea with microcredit, but that even if that doesn't happen, well, promoters of financial inclusion will still tell you that it's useful because people can at least manage their insecure livelihoods better if they have better financial services. They may not be richer than before, but at least they're managing better. And it's also been connected to this idea that macroeconomic development happens thanks to financial development. So if financial services grow, if financial systems grow to be more financially inclusive, then that's going to lead to economic growth, and that trickles down to the poor. What's then happened since this incorporation of microfinance into financial inclusion is that it's all become digitized, that there's now this crusade against cash going on in the name of the poor, because so the story goes, well, in order to reach all the poor people in the world, you cannot do it through cash. You have to digitize everything. You have to put it on mobile phones or other digital payment systems. And in doing so, the promoters of digital financial inclusion are pursuing what I call three holy grails. And just to point out over on the right side, of course, this picture of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, one of the best films ever made. Otherwise, it has no relevance to the plot here. But the three holy grails are firstly, monetizing transaction costs by privatizing the payment rails. What I mean by that is that if payments are no longer done using cash, they tend to go through private payment systems. And these private payment systems they only exist to capture fees that are made either by the payment maker or the payment recipient. So if you can privatize the means of payment, in a sense, the rails on which payments move, that is a way to monetize the transaction costs that happen in any economy. Secondly, the second holy grail that the promoters of digital financial inclusion are after is the value of the big data that gets produced by digital payment systems. Cash leaves very few data trails. The promoters of digital financial services always like to say, therefore it encourages corruption or crime, though it's very hard to prove that. And this big data, of course, is valuable not only economically in that it can be repackaged and analyzed and sold onwards, but also it's politically useful at times in that governments might want to have this. And they might want to have it for the third reason, which is to police and tax the poor. Now, the rich manage to move their money absolutely fine in ways that, of course, are digital and yet escape being traced and monitored as data. But a lot of the promise that is made in the digital financial inclusion story is that through the digital data that becomes available, the payment behaviors of poor people can be studied more actively and more clearly, and they can be nudged and they can be sort of behaviorally re-engineered to spend their money more wisely. But also that you could use digital financial services, digital transactions data to make the informal sector more visible and to formalize the informal sector and basically find new tax handles on the informal sector, which of course will mean taxing the poor more while not changing anything about the way the rich are taxed. Because if you think cash is the problem, then you'd have to believe that all the money documented in the Bermuda Papers or the Panama Papers got to these places by boat, which of course it didn't. It got there digitally, so cash is not the problem. But at the same time, when it comes to taxing digital financial services, no. Taxing the poor, yes, using digital financial services, but taxing the service providers themselves, no. All the proponents of digital financial services say that you shouldn't tax mobile money services because this will harm financial inclusion. And in doing so, they make a structural dependency argument against taxes, which we can recognize very well from things like when the European Union was considering, after the great financial crisis, to put in place a new financial transaction tax or any sort of wider Tobin tax proposal. Financial institutions always lobby against this, saying, well, don't tax the financial sector because otherwise you'll just be increasing inefficiencies in the economy. You're basically so structurally dependent on the financial sector, dear governments, that you shouldn't tax it. And in the same way, they say you shouldn't tax digital financial services because that will harm inclusion. As I said, I think all of this needs to always lead to a so what point. So let me just wrap up with reminding of the fact that I think payments digitalization is about expanding the frontier of financial accumulation in the sense of making it possible for owners of capital to make profits on the everyday market transactions that people have to engage in order to live and work and survive in a market society. And payments digitalization is doing this based on changes in politics, economics, social relations, and culture, such as the removal of cash, in some cases by force, as happened in India in 2014 with demonetization, or through the introduction of central bank digital currencies, or through anti-cash marketing and advertising programs. You can see everywhere advertising that's trying to move people off of cash and onto digital payment rails. And through, as I was showing with the Better Than Cash Alliance, shaping these wider narratives of how cash is somehow, moving off of cash is pro-poor or pro-development and so on. I want to show you on the right, I'm going to be showing you advertisements to wrap up by three very large financial service providers in my area. They're all trying to shape the narrative. You can see American Express, the most expensive way to pay by card, is telling you that really, if you use American Express, you're helping to keep the high streets alive. You're helping communities to thrive. So if you love where you live, then shop small and shop using American Express. Now, why is shop small good for American Express? Because of course the small shops pay much higher credit card fees to American Express than the large shops do, which is why American Express wants to tell you that you should shop locally. Lastly, they're shaping taxation policy as well. The removal of cash agents by saying, well, you shouldn't tax this. You should definitely never tax financial services. You might want to tax the poor, however, by using our data to find new ways of identifying the informal sector and tax evaders. And so all of this basically indicates struggles over the future of money, the future shape, the future ownership of money in a post-cash world. If we're only operating on digital payment rails, will we end up in a form of financial monopoly capitalism where we have to go through a few or perhaps even just one large payment provider to live in this market economy that we live in? I just found it funny as a way of wrapping this up. Before Christmas, waiting for a train in Brighton here in the UK where I live, and one of the favorite things that people love to do in the UK is wait for trains because we love waiting around, and the trains are always late anyway. And if you're standing around in Brighton Station around Christmas time, you would have been able to see actually in direct succession two payment providers, payment systems providers, digital payment systems providers, advertising their own wares in these ways that really are trying to shape societal narratives. So PayPal here saying, well, buy a Christmas gift from not on the high street not from a local shop, buy a Christmas gift online using PayPal. And then they say, then PayPal will support the Prince's Trust. They'll give money to a charity. So PayPal trying to get you onto digital platforms and buying things there using cashless money. On the other hand, on the same screen, immediately afterwards, Visa telling you to shop local this Christmas. Join Visa in supporting your local high street with the hashtag where you shop matters. And you can see here what I was referring to as this struggle over the future of payment systems and future ways of making profits, of accumulating capital out of the sort of transactions that people have to make in order to survive, either by moving everything onto online cashless or moving everything onto the high street cashless, where, again, if you shop local, if you shop in small shops, Visa makes a bigger profit off that than off any larger companies that can negotiate a harder bargain against them. Thank you very much for giving me your attention today. Thank you very much again for the invitation to present to this group. This is a link which you can write down to the opening chapter of the Handbook of Financialization. As I said, I'm sure you'll be able to find the entire book either somewhere in the depths of the internet or hopefully through your institutional access, or if you buy it as a paperback copy. Thank you very much. And I think now we've still got quite a good amount of time for questions, which I'll be very happy to answer. I'll also copy the link into the chat so you can write it down from there. Okay, Adriano, how do we do this? I can't hear you. I don't know if I'm having a sound problem or if it's that. Can anybody else hear Adriano?
Hi, Milford.
Hi, Fernanda. I can hear you, which is great.
Yeah, I have a question from the chat. I can see Adriano is not, yeah, he's not, he's back. I'd let him do it.
Adriano? Your microphone seems to be working now.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so sorry. Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation. I'm sure everybody is more curious to read the book now. We have a question from João Felipe Chagas. I believe he's a student from the graduate program of economics. You can't see it because he's watching in YouTube. So I'll just read the question for you, okay? It's actually two questions and a bit long, but let's try. First question. Could I say that financialization is a broader political economy look at the financial structure of countries? Okay. So this is the first question. Second question, taking the broad perspective of political economy. Sorry, it's a bit long. Taking the broad perspective of political economy as a prism of analysis of micro and macroeconomic structures, and also as an interdisciplinary approach between them, could I say that the essential question is, are the impacts essentially positive, as most conventional financiers believe?
Okay. About the first question, I mean, I think financialization is fundamentally about analyzing changes in the structure of the economy. So it's not about, I would not treat financialization as a variable in any sense, but as a process of change. And I think that matters a lot, that it's understanding this as a process of change. My interpretation or my understanding of the second question is that it's about whether financialization has done more good than harm or more harm than good in terms of economic growth, I understand. And I think here it's interesting that it's, for the most part, the financialization research literature suggests that it has had negative impacts on growth. At the very least, it has been correlated with and concurrent with the slowdown in macroeconomic growth in all parts of the world. But you don't even have to just turn to the financialization literature for this. I mean, even people who work outside of that, outside of this conceptual space, like Ugo Panizza in his World Bank paper with others, I think it was a paper for the IMF around 2015, asking the question, too much finance, finds that above a certain amount of financial depth or finance to GDP ratios, GDP growth goes down, GDP growth starts to decline. It's, and unlike, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff's models about government debt, this hasn't been disproved by a master's student doing their homework properly. So I think it's pretty clear that the overaccumulation of finance has gone hand in hand with a decline in economic growth. What I do want to point out is that there's always, financialization is both a cause and a consequence. And at the same time, it's also been the slowdown of growth in the real economy that has encouraged such a growth in financial accumulation. And that then, of course, leads to these political, one might say, vicious cycles of, trying to keep that cycle of fictitious capital accumulation alive, trying to find new sources of profit, even when the real economy isn't delivering them anymore. But, and I'll stop talking now, it is not just about finance. It's not just about economic growth being affected by finance. There's so much more going on than just GDP and all sorts of other ways in which the massive overexpansion of finance, which we call financialization, has impacted on socioeconomic indicators and socioeconomic changes, such as what Lena Lavina says about the Brazilian welfare system, which really is not about economic growth, but still nonetheless really profound changes in the way people manage their lives and the way people relate to finance.
Thank you, Philip. We have another question from Paulo. I guess Paulo will ask you directly.
Estão me vendo aí? Então tá. Philip, I have two questions related. The first is how to measure financialization. This is an issue that was discussed in the handbook. And the second question, when you talk about the limits, you say there's empiric limits and optic limits. Can you talk a little about these two limits?
So, thank you very much, Paulo, for your question. I'm not going to try to answer something that only Brett Christophers could answer well himself. I would certainly have to look up the answer, if it even is in there, in that second chapter of the handbook where he debates with Ben Fine about these limits to financialization. I think on the first one, I'm sorry to give a kind of non-answer as well, in that I don't want to say there is any right way to measure financialization. But what I mean by that or I'm not going to just say there's no right way. I think what the real answer is that it's context dependent. It depends on what it is you're trying to, what process of change it is you are trying to quantify. So again, I don't see financialization as a static variable that we can measure, this amount of financialization in a particular economy, but we can measure the amount to which an economy has changed. Or in the case of, my research on microfinance, I think what it was possible to measure in my research was the amount of money, the amount of profit, the amount of surplus that is extracted every year from people who borrow very small amounts of money in order to survive economically, and that is extracted to the original finance providers. And in the case of microfinance, it was clear that in the late 1990s, that was just hundreds of millions of dollars per year that was extracted from microfinance borrowers. But by the late 2000s, it had reached more than $20 billion a year that was being extracted. Now, I think what matters there is the amount of change that has happened. We can't say that is $20 billion worth of financialization, but we can say how much more has poverty lending become financialized, where in the past, maybe it was a village loan shark or a small cooperative bank that was doing lending to small-scale micro-entrepreneurs. It's now a globally operating financial system that is perfectly capable of extracting this surplus and moving it to Wall Street or to South Korea. And that amount of increase of how much surplus is extractable, to me, in the case of microfinance, is a measure of the financialization of poverty lending. But if you're looking at commodities, you would want a completely different measure of financialization. If you're looking at very broad scale macro indicators, it might be as simple as, as I mentioned, Ugo Panizza's work already, just to measure the sort of private debt to GDP ratios. It's completely context dependent. So that's why I think it's so important to define and conceptualize for, openly for any readers who are engaging with your work, what it is you understand to financialization to be, and therefore why you're measuring it in this way. And that's what we really wanted to say with the book, that it's not that there's a right and wrong way, but that it's always important to justify.
So comparison is impossible. It's impossible to compare.
I don't think so, but I think it's possible to compare across countries, but not necessarily to find a unifying measure, between the financialization of the household as experienced at the household level and the financialization of households as would be registered at the macroeconomic level.
Okay, thank you for the question, Paulo. Philip,
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Paulo.
We have another question. It's here in the chat, if you prefer to read it, from Denise. Can you see it, or I can read it for you?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
You're asking, could we consider that militarism of American economy is a field that was also financialized, particularly after the war in Ukraine, in which big banks and funds indirectly entered in the conflict as sponsors? I mean, I should be careful not to talk about something that I know very, very little about. But of course, to the extent that, no, let me just say this. I mean, the military industrial complex has always been owned, the companies have always been owned by private shareholders, and they have earned profits off of this. So I would want to know what has changed in a way over time, and in what ways this has become even more about using financial means to extract profits from the activity. I think, I wouldn't want to answer your question with a yes or no or anything. I think it would be fascinating to read a paper about this, especially if it kind of clarifies how you see this as an area of financialization. It's a really interesting question.
Okay, now I have a question. We are seeing the past weeks some problems with regional banks in the US and with Credit Suisse. And of course, it's been a few decades or maybe a century that it's necessary for central banks to act as a lend of last resort because of the systemic risk these institutions pose. But with the financialization, if you now finance dominates or influence more fields of the economy, of the social life, culture, and so on, can you say now that a crisis in the financial system is like more systemic than before? Is it more dangerous if the society is financialized? Is it more dangerous now to have a problem in the financial system than before?
I mean, I think your question is almost, at least to me, it's almost impossible to answer with a no. I mean, if we're seeing as small players as Silicon Valley Bank, and I mean, nobody can even remember what the other one was called, already being so systemically important that they have to be rescued. Now, apparently, we're not supposed to call it a bailout. We can really read into this just how much more finance exerts political control now than it did even in 2007. And I mean, it's one thing Lehman Brothers going under. It's another thing Silicon Valley Bank going under, and it requiring an immediate political response. And I think this, I mean, I talked about this structural dependency argument, right? I mean, the sense in which we all must do our very best and our politicians must do their very best at all times to uphold the structure of finance because we depend on it, it has just grown stronger in the last 15 years. And that's why we still need the term financialization to make sense of these sorts of things. We might need different approaches to studying it than we did in 2007. I also just want to point out, I mean, all of this apparently, at a much more basic level, apparently all of this is because interest rates have gone up, that now these banks are in trouble. But I mean, I just have to ask all the bankers out there, like, what is it you guys do all day? I mean, we all knew interest rates were going up. How is this a surprise? And so I think that really, proves again the fragility of, democracy, at least as we currently have it, in the face of a very strongly controlling, financial system or a capitalist mode of production that currently uses finance to achieve its means. And that's one way of thinking about what financialization is and the political channels through which it operates. And I didn't mention it explicitly, but there's a really great chapter in the handbook on how financialization is reproduced politically by Stefano Pagliari and Kevin Young that, of course, could answer this question much better than I can.
Okay, we have a question from, I believe it's it's a cell phone, I don't know. It's from Milford, I guess. Any comment on US? Can you see it on the chat? We have actually two questions. One from Milford, that's the SS, and then from Fernando Fellows. If you want to.
I can see a question. I don't know, Milford, maybe you just nod if that's yours. Any comment on any comment on US government nominating Ajay Banga, head of MasterCard, as new World Bank chief? Does this not mean digital financial inclusion will accelerate massively and to the benefit of US-based financial institutions? Another question that would be hard to answer with no, right? I mean, I find it fascinating that in the conversations Milford and I have, it's often Milford who knows much more about the sort of day-to-day politics and of this, and has a much clearer eye on the people who are sort of actively involved in this. And I mean, the rotating door, of course, is fascinating between MasterCard and the World Bank, and it's really clear to me that things shouldn't be this way, and that there's a real subversion of development going on in it. But in these conversations, then I often find myself fixating, and Milford, that's great to point out, and thank you. I think it really enriches the discussion to just bring that in today. But I find it fascinating that we even live in a world in which the former head of MasterCard is a plausible choice as a World Bank chief. And that in a way, the thinking about what development could mean has become so financialized that financial services feature in some way or other in 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, there is no Sustainable Development Goal on financial inclusion, even though the financial inclusion lobbying community lobbied very heavily for this, but they managed to bring it in different ways into 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals as part of the target and indicator framework. And so financial services are seen as central to, central to everything that as societies we want to do and achieve. And this is why we end up in this structural dependency situation, where even if some, absolute third-rate bank somewhere in Western America starts to run into trouble, that everybody suddenly really quickly needs to act. And in the same way, when the World Bank faces off against the next, when the World Bank engages in the next sovereign debt crisis, which is inevitable, sadly, at this point, what sort of decisions is it going to make, regardless of who is at the head of it? Even though, of course, it doesn't help if Ajay Banga is making those decisions for the World Bank. Yeah, but just to say that a little more clearly again, I think on the one hand, it is fascinating, the sort of individual, the people politics and the micro politics of this, and the interests, the strings that get pulled behind the scenes. But at another level, perhaps at a structural level of discourses and ideologies and ideas, I find it fascinating that we have ended up in a world where all of this makes sense.
And one more question on the chat from Fernando Fellows.
I'm doing so much talking. Could you please read it out, Adriano?
Sure. It's a great experience to read the handbook. The richness of the research areas is impressive. However, despite some mentions, the issue of digitalization or digital financialization is not addressed. Does it make sense to consider digital structures as a new step in financialization, or is it not worth studying this topic deeply yet?
Thank you. It's really good. I mean, firstly, thank you for the praise. That's very, very kind, very nice to hear. And secondly, I don't want to sound too defensive by saying that, with 44 chapters, at some point we had to stop. But I think you're absolutely right that we didn't make digitalization an explicit topic or chapter of its own. In a way, it's present in many ways in many of the chapters, but perhaps we'd overlooked something there a little bit, and perhaps digitalization is a new step in financialization, at least in the following sense. I would think of it analytically as a new step, in that financialization is already a kind of loosening and unmooring, a separation of accumulation from concrete places and concrete enterprises, and a kind of placelessness in a way, although geographers, of course, will, and I don't want to contradict all the fascinating geography of financialization that relocates place in it. But, going back to, Alietta's and Robert Boyer's and so on, conceptualization of what goes on when finance becomes so dominant. In a way, it's capital becoming more mobile and, responding to crisis in a way by making itself ready to shift away from particular concrete places that are going into crisis. And digitalization is another way of unmooring and loosening this connection of, accumulation to concrete places and productive activities. For example, with financial inclusion, it used to be that microcredit was about funding a specific micro enterprise that is sitting on a street corner somewhere in a town selling mangoes, or a specific person who might be riding around in a specific town on a microcredit borrowed motorbike providing motor taxi services. But with financial inclusion as digital financial inclusion, it's all about providing payment services from whatever place to whatever place, and about extracting profits from that. So we can definitely see a way in which digitalization, I don't know if it represents a new phase, but perhaps represents, as you suggest, a new step, a new kind of development that we want to pay more attention to, and maybe we didn't pay enough attention to in the handbook, despite 44 billion chapters.
Okay, I think we don't have any more. Sorry, just one more question.
No, there's a nice question which I'd love to answer. It just came up.
From Linit, which are your thoughts about the definancialization? How do you think would be a consistent way to promote definancialization?
I mean, how radical do you want to get, right? Because, of course, we want to live in a world in which there are fewer crises that disrupt everything. And so, we could go back to a sort of Bretton Woods world in which banks are neatly regulated and Keynesian macroeconomic demand management happens. And I won't say anything about the possibilities of going back to that, except that I want to say it doesn't strike me as necessarily radical enough considering the challenge. And then the question is, of course, well, what sort of crisis do you think it needs to fundamentally disrupt financialization? And I don't know that any of us have the answers of where, the great societal transformations that make things better in the world come from. And I'm, not going to talk about any sort of great revolution that overthrows capitalism. That's not what I'm an expert in. But I do find it fascinating that again and again, some of the most vulnerable subjects of financialization, some of the most vulnerable participants in international debt systems have found ways of resisting them and disrupting them. And I mean microcredit borrowers who, for example, in Bolivia in 2000, protested, in the context of other protests against the government and against privatization and structural adjustment, successfully protested to get part of their debts scratched off. Part of their debts were written off because of the social movements that they organized. Similarly, in Nicaragua in 2008, in part of the country, a movement called No Pago, I don't have to translate that into Portuguese, formed, which ultimately one might say was corrupted or co-opted by the government, and no comment on Daniel Ortega as a government figure. But, again, it demonstrated that people power exercised through things like burning tires on the Pan American Highway managed to get a large percentage of the country's debts written off for individual debts held by poor people. And in the place where I did my own PhD research in Andhra Pradesh, in India in 2010, it tragically took the suicides of about 60 to 80 people who killed themselves after they were told by microcredit officers to kill themselves so that their family could receive debt relief from the life insurance which they had been sold with the loan. But after those people took their own lives, terribly, a protest movement erupted like has rarely been seen before in Andhra Pradesh in southern India, which forced the government to intervene and close down all microcredit lending in Andhra Pradesh. And more than $1 billion worth of microcredit debts were written off because of people power. And because people found a way to discover that basically they're all borrowers together. They have a class interest in engaging in solidarity with one another to overcome financialization in the form of the microcredit that had led them into debt traps. And so I want to say, if it's possible for people who are operating effectively on the brink of starvation, as many people in southern India in 2010 were, then it's possible for people who are somewhat more privileged to undermine financialization through, discovering the shared interests that debtors have in no longer upholding the system. I don't know when and where that exactly happens. And part of the problem is that I try to get funding for research on it again and again, and I just never get it because I don't know, maybe it's too radical or maybe it's just crazy or something. But definancialization is fascinating. And I think it's interesting that it doesn't necessarily take our political leaders, be they Lula or be they whoever else, to, suddenly realize that it would be better for us to have less financialized systems, but that it's also possible to work with much more radical grassroots movements to, undermine the premises of the debt system. And, at the same time, perhaps also to work on solidaric alternatives. And I know Brazil has quite some interesting solidaric alternatives for financial services provision. I know very little about them. I know that borrowers around the world organize themselves, or not borrowers, but people organize themselves to do finance in much more solidaric ways. And through working in these solidaric models, to create alternatives, but also at the same time to encourage people to recognize that they have, and work with people who recognize that they have shared common collective interests to undermine financialization. Maybe that's the root of how to move into a post-financialization world.
Philip, if we have time for just one more, and then we're done. Is it okay? Is it almost?
I'm okay. It's 3:30 in the afternoon in the UK. I still have lots of time.
Okay. So Paulo, go ahead.
Well, Philip, I was intrigued with the second graph, diffusion across academic disciplines. The first interdisciplinary, the second heterodox economic, and the third geography. Why geography is the third?
I just want to bring that up again so people
Oh,
can see.
okay.
Did you mention?
Yes.
Can you see it? This one.
Yes. Why geography? I'm intrigued with that. And you see, it's the three first are far ahead from the other.
Yeah. So I have to be honest that there's two possible explanations for it. One is that geography, and we do see a lot of papers on financialization published in geography, in part by people who have not managed to get them published in their own field. So heterodox economists who've not managed to get them into good economics journals will find a good geography journal.
Infiltrated.
Sorry?
Infiltrated.
Yeah, or it's a displacement of sorts, perhaps. And I think, we did this by coding journals and assigning them to particular disciplines. And it's also possible that geography, with its very wide, heterodox, sort of interdisciplinary nature, kind of was overcoded a little bit. That's the other possible explanation. But I think, I'm currently finalizing a special issue on the financialization of water in the global south. That could have, by the way, with some great scholars from Brazil involved too, that could have been in a political science journal, it could have been in a development studies journal, it could have been in a sociology journal, but we've ended up in a geography journal because they're just really interested in this thing. But I think only maybe 2 people in the special issue are actually geographers. And so it perhaps says more about the field of geography as a kind of, yeah, maybe infiltrator, as you say, or an open door for people from other fields who, you know, want to say something interesting, than it says something about, you know, geographers as researchers being the ones who are most interested in financialization.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you too for the question.
Okay, I think we're done now. I want to thank you again, Philip, in behalf of the Finde, the financialization group, the economics graduate program from WOOF, and of course, in behalf of everyone that watched the presentation, and thank you everybody for the questions, the comments, and okay, thank you so much, and hope we can have you in some other opportunity here.
I mean, please, in person. I'm sorry, you have a great conference in Rio this year, Sase, and
yeah.
If it wasn't the case that I'm about to become a dad in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I would have been delighted to see you all there. I mean, the one time Sase goes to Rio, it's just such poor timing. But otherwise, yeah, I hope to meet many of you in person. And thank you very much for this opportunity to present the book and my research to you. Thank you very much, Adriano, for hosting this. And thank you, Fernanda, for the invitation, which is lovely. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and their attention.
Thank you, Phil.
Bye.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.